Welcome to Devotions Debrief again with me, Pastor Joe. We're looking through some of the ideas that I brought up in a sermon I preached recently called The Superpower of Suffering, looking at the way that Moses had to go through a journey. And then part of the journey was him discovering that in order to see the great things of God in the future of his life, that he was going to have to accept that there were going to be trials, suffering, and pain. And his attitude towards suffering did change. He actually chose to suffer rather than just enjoy the pleasures of his life or the pleasures that the world could offer. And when that attitude changed, his destiny changed. And I think that that's really important for us too. And our attitude towards suffering is something that's so important. And so I wanted to just encourage us from the scriptures, and we're using Hebrews chapter 12 as a guide, because in Hebrews chapter 12, he talks about how all of these suffering, trials, and difficulties that we're going through in our lives, we can all see them through the lens of a loving God allowing discipline in our lives so that we become more mature, but also so we grow into our identity as children of God. We see that God allows suffering because it's God who is loving us. It's God who is growing us, and God wants us to mature. He wants us to become all the things that he planned for us. So as we read here, we're going to read right now Hebrews chapter 12, verses 11 to 13. He says, "For in the moment all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Therefore lift your drooping hands and strengthen your weak knees, and make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather healed." I find the imagery in this one quite interesting. It has a lot to do with the attitude of our hearts when it comes to suffering. In Hebrews chapter 12, he's really trying to draw us into the good thing that God is doing. Now, but I know for you and for me, it's very common for us to get, when we have to go through difficulties, that we get this, oh, do I have to? We get drooping arms, we get weak knees, we lose all intentionality about it. It's like we kind of act like teenagers, right? Who got to clean up our room, or we have to do our study, and you can just imagine a teenager that's told to go upstairs and do your homework, and they hang their arms and they walk with uncertain and undirected steps, like they just don't want to put any effort into this anymore. Now, if you're like me, you've probably been there, not once, but dozens of times in your life. And I think that's why the book of Hebrews brings these things up, because that attitude is crippling. That's what he says. What is lame becomes disfigured. It actually cripples us. And that attitude encourages us to think of the discipline that God is giving us or allowing for us in our lives, that we end up kind of walking in this rejection of it. And that attitude keeps us from growing, it keeps us from maturing, and it keeps us from actually getting to the new place. So I would like, instead, could you adopt this attitude? Could you please get excited about discipline? Excited. So not droopy arms, but cheering arms. Yeah! In a book I was reading called Stopping the Noise in Your Head, he talks about, as somebody that was learning martial arts, that in martial arts, there's all kinds of things that you've got to learn about defending yourself and doing all these different kind of moves. And some of those things come from body strengthening exercises and all kinds of push-ups and sit-ups and these movements and that move, done hundreds and hundreds of times to strengthen the core and do all of these things. But when it came to the difficult thing that he noticed was that when it came to actually testing those things out in a combat experience, obviously not fight to the death, but people challenging their skills against somebody else, when the other person was better than them, that they would oftentimes end up on the mat. And hitting the mat, falling to the ground, is a painful experience, both emotionally painful and the shame of being overcome, but also physically painful of smacking down on the mat as that person overcomes your abilities and throws you to the ground. Now, he said what was transformative is the attitude of learning to love the mat. Love the mat. Because he said, and I agree with this, that every time you hit the mat, it's a sign that you're learning. You're part of the learning process. It's actually a good sign, not a bad sign. It means that you are grappling with something that's big, that's difficult, but it's worthy. And you've got to find ways, you've got to learn, and you've got to grow. You see, hitting the mat, the pain of that is actually good for us. It's good for our growth. It's good for us to see where we're at. It's good to see what we need to learn. And so I think it'd be great if we could just cheer up a bit and to actually maybe make an attitude change towards the trials in our lives. Oh, why do I have to live with this person? Why do I have to put up with that person? Why do I have to go through these trials? We can have so many teenage, meltdowns. But the truth is, we are going to do much better when we go, I really want to learn this. So if it means I've got to go through trials to get there, every one of those trials is going to be a sign that I'm on the right track. How's your attitude towards suffering? It's part of the way that God is leading you forward in your future. So strengthen those arms, those weak knees, lift them up. Get a attitude of purpose in your life towards growing, and God is going to use that to see you mature. God bless you, and we'll see you next week.